but you had asked about how I sort of began the healing. And so it was my kids were young when the Columbine High School massacre happened. They were 1 and 4 at the time. And I really wanted to get involved in gun violence prevention, but I didn't know how. Like, you can't just call up an organization and say, I'm here.
Yeah.
Right. I have no skills, but I'm here. So I had heard about this campaign called the Asking Saves Kids campaign. And it's this campaign that encourages parents to ask if there's a gun in somebody's house before you let your kids play in their home, because
Yes.
it's a safety question. And so it's at the beginning when I heard about it, I was like, well, how are you going to ask this question? It feels like you're asking, hey, how much money do you make? Or some inappropriate
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
But what I learned is that it's really not about judgment about gun ownership. It has nothing to do with
Right.
that. It's about safety.
Right.
So when my kids were 1 and 4, they'd go to play dates. I'd take them over, and then I would ask about, what kind of dog is there? Is there a swimming pool? What kind of TV shows are the kids going to be watching? Who's supervising? So these are all safety questions, right? And so then on top of it, also, oh, do you have any guns in your
Yep.
home that the kids could get into? And if you do have guns, are they locked up and the ammunition stored separately? And so it wasn't a tough question to ask. It was, if my kids were allergic to peanuts, I certainly wouldn't hesitate
Yes.
and say, oh, I don't, that's kind of embarrassing to ask the question about peanuts. And so I actually one time asked a friend, I said, hey, look, my son is not allergic to peanuts, but he's deathly allergic to guns.
Ah, yes.
And right. And so sometimes I would use humor in this
Yeah.
question, but that's where I got my start. Is I went to my daughter's elementary school PTA president and said, can I talk to the PTA about this? So I go into a group of about 15 women and I tell them my experience learning about the Asking Saves Kids campaign, and then I talk about ways to ask this question, and so that's really how I started, and that gave me a little bit of confidence. I learned how to speak in public. If you call 10 women in a PTA, like in the elementary school lunchroom, if
I would
that's
say it's
public
a good
speaking,
start.
I suppose technically.
Yeah.
But yeah, so then it just kind of went from there, and I got more confidence, I got more experiences. Other PTAs found out about it, invited me in, and then I'm moving forward. And as I'm doing this work around gun violence prevention, I'm getting really frustrated with the conversations about this duality of either you're pro-gun or anti-gun, and so, or what statistics are correct, and which
Yeah.
do we include suicides? I got an argument with a guy who said you shouldn't include suicides because those people wanted to die anyway. And I thought, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. If someone dies from suicide by gun, they're still dead.
Right.
And it's still tragic, and people still miss them.
Right.
So anyway, I just got frustrated with these conversations. And so I became really interested in the stories. I wanted to know, how does a mom get out of bed the day after she finds out her child has been killed? I'm so grateful to not know that personal
Yeah.
experience, but I have a lot of friends who have had this experience, and
God.
I'm still amazed. I'm amazed that they can do life.
I can't imagine. I just can't. Like, the tears started to well up in my eyes because I can't even go there. Like, even my grandchildren, I just can't even imagine
Yeah.
how you do that. I mean, I thought I was strong. I don't know if I'm that strong. You
Yeah,
wonder.
right.
I don't want to find out.
Right. So I started interviewing people who had lost loved ones to gun violence, especially children. And I wrote a book that came out in 2009 called Beyond the Bullet. And it's about 19 people who lost a loved one to gun violence. And I tell their stories. And it was an incredible experience. And then I wanted to write another book because after the Sandy Hook shooting, Wayne LaPierre, who's the spokesperson at the time for the NRA, went on TV a couple days later and said the best way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. And so I struggled with that because I thought, well, okay, so what, you're the good guy with the gun, you saved the day, but then isn't there a cost to you? Like, doesn't that
Yes.
impact you?
Yes.
You just go and have dinner and then the rest of your life? And so I wanted to write a book, but I felt like it was very going to be very nuanced. And so I partnered with an incredible filmmaker in my hometown, and we created this film. I directed and produced a documentary that's on Amazon called Behind the Bullet. And I interviewed 4 people who bought a gun for self-defense and then used it to shoot and kill somebody. And this one guy I interviewed, there was an intruder in his home. When he came home, they were in his house stealing stuff. He shot both of them. One of them died on his front lawn. And this was 3 years before I interviewed him. And he has nightmares. He has tripwires
Yeah.
around his house. He's worried about this happening again. And his life is completely changed. And so there's a moral injury that happens when you shoot and kill somebody, even if the law says that you're
Right.
justified, and even if it's in self-defense. And so I told those stories. And what I found out, Lisa, is I was really good at telling people's stories, but I was ignoring my own.
Oh,
I was
oh
I
yeah.
was constantly I was constantly digging into other
Mm-hmm.
people's trauma and other people's pain and finding out, how do you deal with this? How do you
Yeah.
live with this? How do you, and even with that, the regret and the guilt and the shame around killing somebody else. And so I got to a point where I realized I need to tell my own story. I'm known for my gun violence prevention work and my storytelling, but I had this secret that I was keeping, and I was just so much shame around what had happened to me, with the sexual abuse, the physical abuse, the emotional abuse. And I think so many of us who've experienced this kind of abuse carry that shame.
Yeah.
And we don't live in a society that really wants to hear all about that. And I think
Exactly.
we have to tell our
Hmm.
stories, because too many of us have experienced that, and only until we only until we tell our stories do we start to come out from that blanket of shame.
100%. 100%. And there's a statistic out there that on average, women who are sexually abused is between the ages of 13 and 17. And
Hmm.
they don't tell their story for 4 decades. And I know that to be true, not just in sexual abuse. I know that in working with women, I had one woman who hadn't told her story. She was in her 70s and she didn't even tell her husband of 50 something years. There was so much deep, deep shame. And I've said it before, when we hold those secrets inside of us, they have power. And once you speak them out, they lose some of their power.
Yeah, it's so true. When I was at a conference, a conference up in Seattle, and a friend of mine who survived the Virginia Tech shooting, he was speaking and he was telling his story about survival and the tragedy that had unfolded there, and what it had done to him physically, being shot 4 times and surviving, and the loss of his friends. And so he was telling this story, and people were really interested in it, and they were leaning forward. And
Hmm.
afterwards, people were asking him questions. And it's this huge trauma that he's experienced, and it warrants the curiosity, and it warrants
Hmm.
the like leaning into, and what happened and how did that affect you. But when survivors of especially sexual abuse, childhood sexual abuse, that's a huge trauma. But
Yeah.
I've noticed when I talk about it, no one's leaning in. No one's saying, "Oh
Yeah.
my gosh, what happened?
Yeah.
How did you survive that? How does that impacted you?" There's a ew
Yeah.
kind of
Ick
factor.
factor. Yeah.
And I find it really interesting that certain traumas in our culture warrant sort of questions and exploration, and
Mhm.
others are just like, yeah,
I
I
don't
don't want
want
to
to
know
talk
about
about
that.
that. Yeah.
And then what that does to us is it furthers the shame, and it furthers the aloneness of it.
Hmm.
And so I think those of us who have experienced it being in community with other people who've also experienced it, there's a feeling of camaraderie and like,
Yes.
oh, you get it. You get why I am the way I am.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so much shame in that. And, you know, and the what I have found in the years that I've worked in this in trauma is that when we tell our stories, it opens the opportunity for us to connect with others. Because I know when I do the workshop, one of the first night, that's the only night that we talk about anything in our like trauma like that, our story per se. And we have the women just tell one real quick story, the first thing that comes to their mind. And you know, when these women, when I used to do it in my home and I would watch them, there was just this incredible fear of them having to share, but they would. But by the end of the, you know, like halfway through the stories, you can see the connection already. You can see the women kind of relaxing, like, I'm not in this alone. Like there's somebody else dealing with that because they haven't shared this ever. And so there's a connection. And by the end of the night, these women are connected. They're connected. It's magical.
That is true. And I think there's also this bravery in it, right?
Oh,
When
yeah.
someone tells their story, then you think, oh, I can tell mine. And so, you know, we talked at the beginning of this conversation about this sort of strange path that I've been on, or different path, I guess we should
Yes.
frame it that way. But the Asking Saves Kids campaign was similar to that, where I would ask somebody, hey, do you have guns in your home? You know, so my kids don't get into so that the kids are safe during this play date. And they would often say, oh my gosh, what a great question. No, I don't have any guns in my home, but oh my gosh, I've never thought to ask.
Yeah.
I should start asking that. So it was this contagious thing. And so I'm finding that true to be with stories of abuse, childhood abuse, is telling your story often allows other people to have the bravery to tell their story.
Yes.
And on and on and on. And so I found it just interesting that I found these two things go hand in hand that seem very different.
Yes.